So what I'm going to look at today is a little bit different. So I'm going to look at the development of continuum of reading. And again, I think probably there's a lot of knowledge already in the room. So I'll very briefly go through. Just so you know, this is what, by the time I talk, usually, this is exactly where we are. So that basically I should just jump to questions right now. What I'm going to focus on is really three things. I'm going to focus on how do children learn how to read? Why do some children have difficulty learning to read? And to a very brief degree today, I'll talk about what can you do to prevent or remediate reading failure. One of the things that when you walked in this morning and you got your package, your black folder, there is an article in there. It's called Catch Them Before They Fall. It is by, the article is written by Dr. Joseph Torgerson, who probably is one of the leading people in terms of starting this movement of early assessment, early intervention. Very much an important person in the move towards understanding and remediating reading difficulties. What I would like you to do with the article, and I kind of put a little bullet on the top of it, don't focus on the assessment strategies per se that are in there. Focus on the overall message of the paper, which is that we can identify kids with reading difficulties early. We can remediate those difficulties early, and for many kids who have reading-based difficulties or early struggles, we can prevent them from have those turning into a learning disability. So that's really the key. So don't get tied down and, oh, I got to do all this assessment or all this. Go with the main message, which is we can do a lot to identify them and to remediate, so a lot of kids end up not having reading-based difficulties if we support them the right way. That's the key that I hope you take from the article. So one of the things that when we talk about reading is we have to acknowledge that reading is a very complex enterprise. It requires a number of sub-skills. It requires coordination and simultaneous processing. And if you fail or you have issues at any one of those skills or processes, you are going to have difficulty learning to read. So it is a very, very complex process. When we talk about what is it that we want to do, what do we want every child to be able to do? We often say, you know what, our goal is to help every student learn to read at grade level or above. What do we mean? Well, we usually mean that we want them to be able to read grade level text, and we want them to have a reasonable understanding of what they've read. We want them also to be fluent in their reading so that they can fluently read what it is that they were required to read, and it doesn't take a long time. It doesn't take an insubordinate or an inordinate amount of time to do that. And typically, I think this is the key one that we have to come down to. We want the children that we're teaching to find pleasure in reading. We want them to find the same pleasure that we have in reading in terms of being able to read the material, to be able to not have to struggle with words, and to focus on meaning and enjoy what's coming from the printed word in front of them. So if you think about it, what skills and knowledges and attitudes then do we have to have for reading comprehension? We know that to become a proficient reader, it basically comes down to a number of different things, and especially proficient at reading comprehension. You have to have accurate and fluent word reading skills. So you have to be able to decode and read words. You have to have oral language skills that Shelley talked about, vocabulary, linguistic comprehension. You have to have factual knowledge. We know that a lot of what we do in terms of reading comprehension is improved by having factual knowledge to support what you're reading about. You have to have knowledge and skills in the use of cognitive strategies to improve comprehension or repair it when it breaks down. You have to have reasoning and inferential skills, and you have to have motivation to understand and interest in the task and material. So motivation becomes a key aspect as well. So if you think about it, accurate and word reading fluency is one area. All of that middle area that just came up, that's what Shelley was talking about. That's the language comprehension component that she was talking about. And then I'm also going to discuss motivation a little bit when we get near the end of the presentation, because motivation in reading is also extremely key. And I'm sure every one of you works with students who are not motivated to read. So in other words, when we think about students' reading comprehension, here's what it depends on. How well they read the words on the page, how much knowledge they have and how well they think, and then how motivated are they actually to do the work of comprehension. And again, for some of our struggling readers, it's not just how motivated are they to do the work of reading comprehension, how motivated are they just to do the reading part if they're struggling with the reading part, just getting the words off the page. So as psychologists, we often come back and we say that, you know what, if you think about reading comprehension, there are many sub-skills, many strands that are woven into it. So basically, I want to break it down into two today. We have, for someone to be a skilled reader with good reading comprehension, you have to have language comprehension. So all of the things that Shelley talked about, that background knowledge, the vocabulary knowledge, the language structure, the verbal reasoning, the literacy knowledge. But you also have to have the word recognition part, which is the phonological phonemic awareness, the decoding and spelling skills, and the sight recognition. What we know, though, is that when we look at that diagram, there are three potential reasons or issues that prevent children from becoming good readers. The first is what we call the difficulty learning to read words accurately and fluently. So we're going to talk about that, but again, it's the ability just to read the words, decode the words. The second reason that a lot of kids struggle with becoming a good reader is because they don't have the sufficient vocabulary or general knowledge, or they don't have those reasoning skills that support comprehension of written language. And the last one is that we are going to work with some kids that have an absence or loss of initial motivation to read, and that failure that sometimes over time to appreciate the value and the rewards of reading. If everything works wonderfully, about 70 to 80% of children, some of them with some support, will have this beautiful green line that the language comprehension and the word recognition skills will go together, and they will be very efficient, coordinated, good reading comprehenders. So what I want to look at today very briefly is how do children learn to read? So what phonemic and what phonological awareness skills are there? And what we have to think about again is the process of skill acquisition. Children come in at a very novice level, and then at some point we want to get them to what we consider to be an expert level. Most of us in this room are probably at the expert level, okay? Our expert level of those skills is such that if, you know, there's emails that go around and they're like, we live in the cyclic email age now, where you get this email and about 3 years later you'll get the exact same email. Some of you may have seen the email where it's a paragraph. Every single word is spelt wrong in the paragraph. However, the first letter is right, the last letter is right, but every other letter that's in the word is mixed up. How come every one of you can read that at the same fluency and quickness and understanding, despite the fact that every single word in the paragraph is spelt wrong? It is because your level of unconscious processing is so high when it comes to reading and phonetics that your brain is automatically putting all those words together just because the first letter and the last letter were in the right position. Your brain is so automatic, it's so efficient now, it's just doing that because that's what it does. And you do it much faster. You can do that with basically what the research shows when they've kind of done that passage. Good readers read that as fast as if every word was spelled correctly. There is no time difference between reading it spelled correctly and every word spelled incorrectly. So we are much faster. But we have to acknowledge that when kids come in the early years, they are at a novice level. Everything that they're doing in terms of reading phonetic skills is all at a conscious processing level. There is a level of effort, and it is in their consciousness that they're having to work with those skills, and it's time intensive. It is hard work for them at the beginning. So the question usually becomes, why would we want to teach phonemical awareness? Why do we want to teach decoding? Why do we want to teach phonics? Well, one of the reasons we want to do it is that we know that it accelerates the reading growth of all children. Every single child benefits if we teach phonological awareness and decoding skills. Every single child does. Shelley talked about that there are many students that come in who are ELL or English as a second language. They don't have a lot of those letters. They don't have some of those sounds in their first language. We teach that because it is a teachable skill, is that we are going to therefore accelerate the reading of those students. We do know that 20 to 30% of children will remain poor readers without it. If we don't directly teach phonics and decoding, we know that about 20 to 30% of kids will not develop those skills. And we're going to talk a little bit, and I think Shelley mentioned it a little bit today, this idea of co-articulation. So when we talk about languages, when you are trying to learn or you're listening to another language that you're not familiar with, it does sound like every single word and every single sound just blends together. We have many children that what they struggle with, that they can't pick out the individual sounds in words, especially when we have those blends that go together, right? So if we do the st sound, st, and you put it in another word, it's co-articulated in. We don't hear the s and the t, right? It's st, right? So what happens is a lot of kids can't hear that. They can't hear that co-articulation. Okay, at least Angeline snickers every time, so at least I know one person in the room snickers at least once. Thank you, Angeline, again. Okay, so the question becomes, do I need to know my sounds to read? And the answer is yes, you do need to know your sounds to read. So Shelley did differentiate between phonological awareness and phonemic awareness. Typically that phonological awareness is that understanding of the different ways that spoken language then maps or can be broken down into smaller units. So sentences to words, words to syllables, syllables to phonemes. But what I'm really interested in, what I'm going to present a little bit more on today, is more that phonemic awareness. That idea that it's a much more specific term, and it's the ability to hear, to identify, and for me as a psychologist, manipulate individual sounds. So it is that ability to blend, to segment, and manipulate those sounds, okay? And what speech and language pathologists will often tell you, those are all the skills that you can do with your eyes closed. The blending, the segmenting, the manipulation, you're doing those with your eyes closed. The other thing that as psychologists, we often then refer to it as the alphabetic principle. So I think many of you have heard that word, the alphabetic principle. So again, print represents speech through the alphabet. All of our words are comprised of those internal sounds that are called phonemes. And basically, in learning how to read, that child has to make explicit all those implicit sound structures. So all those specific phoneme sounds, and it requires a great deal of time for some children to develop that. Some children develop it easily, some children develop it have more difficulty doing it. I often talk with parents who have kids with reading disabilities, and one of the things that I'll tell them if it's phonetic based is your child has part of the secret code, they just haven't got all of the code yet, right? And we're continuing to work on that code. And you can't read effectively and fluently until you have all of the code. What's most important, or what I hope you take out of the presentation I'm doing today the most, is this, is that we know that phonological skills develop in a very predictable fashion or progression. So if you know what the progression is, then you know what you can expect at each age that the child is learning how to read. You kind of have an idea of what they should have in JK, and then SK, and then in grade 1, and then in grade 2. And honestly, what we know, most of the research tells us, is that most of the stuff that we're talking about, and I'm talking about today, for most students, pretty much by the end of grade 3, all of the reading skills that they have in terms of the phonetics and the decoding are there, right? And now everything else is just consolidation of that a little bit more, and then it's practice. So pretty much for the average student, everything that they need to learn how to read in terms of these skills and processes is in place by grade 3. We consolidate it, and everything else after that is practice. Okay? But it also brings us to the scary part, which is if you have a student who gets to the end of grade 1 who's not reading at grade level, it's about an 80 to 85% chance that they will never read at grade level. If we get them to the end of grade 2 and they're not reading at grade level, then it's about 85 to 90% that they'll never read at grade level. And if they get to that end of grade 3 and they're not reading at grade level, then it's about a 95% chance that they'll never read at grade level without substantial and very heavy-duty intervention, very intensive intervention. Basically, Shelley talked a lot about all the prerequisites that are required to become a good reader, but I want to focus more on what's that developmental continuum. So if we were to just do a basic chart and kind of say, okay, how do phonological skills go from most basic to most advanced? Well, here's what it looks like. The most basic phonological skill is just word awareness. Being able to track words and sentences, that's the most basic. The second level is what we call responsiveness to rhyme and alliteration during wordplay. So it is the ability and to hear rhymes, to be able to play with rhymes, and also to kind of be drawn to certain repeating phrases in nursery rhymes. That's why kids are drawn so much to nursery rhymes, because of the alliterations that are in those nursery rhymes. The next step is just kind of the middle part of our phonological skills, is basically that syllable awareness, when those kids can now count, tap, blend, or segment words into syllables. Then we go on to onset rhyme and manipulation. So onset rhyme is the ability to produce a rhyming word, and it depends on understanding that rhyming words have the same rhyme. And most of you will probably have some kids in your class who can, if you tell them rhyming words, they can pick out the rhyming words, but they can't generate a rhyming word themselves. That is a much more difficult task, to be able to generate a rhyme versus just hear rhymes, okay? And then the last stage, or the most advanced stage of phonological skill, is what we call phoneme awareness. And that's the ability to match, identify and match the initial sounds in words, then move to the end, then move to the middle. That's usually the progression. First sound is what they can do the easiest. Second sound is the next thing that they're able to do. And thirds, those middle sounds are typically the most difficult. So it goes from beginning to end and then back into the middle. Okay? It's being able to segment and produce the initial sound, then the final and the middle sounds. It's blending sounds into words. And again, there are many kids that you probably work with that if you give them the parts of the word in the chunks, they can then tell you what the word was. If you then ask them to read the word and chunk it themselves, they can't do that, because again, that's a more advanced skill. It's segmenting phonemes into 2 or 3 sound words, moving to 4 or 5 sound words as they become a little more proficient. And by the end, the most advanced phoneme awareness is really manipulating phonemes by removing, adding, or subtracting sounds. Okay, so that's basically how it goes from the most basic to the advanced in a very general one-page chart. To kind of just go a little bit deeper, and not a lot deeper, but to say, okay, at what age do 80 to 90% of typical students achieve a phonological skill? That gives us really the benchmark to kind of know where we need to be in order to kind of know that they're progressing in the right manner. So at 4 years old, we're expecting being able to basically rote intimation and enjoyment of rhyme and alliteration. So they'll be attracted to things like pool, drool, tool. They're attracted to things like seven silly snakes sang songs seriously. That's that rote intimidation and enjoyment. By age 5, they should have rhyme recognition. They should be able to determine what's the odd word out, which 2 words rhyme, stare, steal, chair. They'll be able to tell you stare and chair. They have a recognition of phonemic change in words. So if you say hickory dickory clock, they know that that's not right. Although, again, some of the older nursery rhymes, many children are not exposed to many of those nursery rhymes as they used to be. So it's not uncommon now for them not to know many of the nursery rhymes that we know. The other thing is, by 5 years, you should be able to see clapping, counting syllables. So they know truck is 1 syllable. They know airplane is 2 syllables. So they're able to break and clap those and count those syllables. By the time they get to 5.5 years old, they should now be able to distinguish and remember separate phonemes in a series. So some of you have probably seen Elkinen boxes where I can give a chip a sound and then you slide it up. They should be able to basically be able to slide a sound up into the box, okay? They should also be able to do blending, onset, and rhyme. So that if you say what word, they know thumb, queen is queen. By 5.5 years old, they should also now be able to produce a rhyme. So they should be able to tell you a word that rhymes with car. And the other thing that they should do by 5.5 years old is they should be able to match initial sounds and isolate an initial sound. So say the first sound in ride, sock, love, they would be able to basically be able to identify those sounds for you by 5.5. By 6, they're now able to do what we call compound word deletion. So if you say to them, cowboy, say it again, don't say the cow, they can say boy. So they're starting to manipulate and do some deletion. They should have syllable deletion. If I say parsnip, say it again, but don't say the par, they're able to do snip. Blending 2 or 3 phonemes, so if you give them z, oo, they should be able to do that. And by 6, they should now be doing this independently, right? So they should be able to take the word shop and go sh-op, and blend those together. By 6, they should also be able to segment words that have simple syllables into 2 or 3 phonemes, but we're not always seeing the blends yet. So sh, e, m, e, n, l, e, g. If you give them those words, they can blend them together and tell you what they are. By 6.5, we have the phoneme segmentation, but now we have the blends as well. So say the words slowly while you tap the sounds, b, a, k, right? They can put those blends together now. And they also have phoneme segmentation to build new words. So if I say, you know what, change the j sound in cage to n, they're able to manipulate that to now, though, if I take the j sound out and put an n sound in, it's cane, right? This is a much more sophisticated skill because now they're really being able to manipulate those sounds, take one out, and then put one back, put the new one in, because that one little sound changes the entire word. By 7, they're doing sound deletion of initial and final positions. By 8, it's sound deletion, and they're now able to do the initial and include blends. And by 9, because we're wrapping it all up, they're able to do sound deletion that's medial and final blend positions as well. So that basically the last year and a half and 2 years is a lot about being able to truly manipulate those sounds and be able to delete, add to, and come up with how those sounds change the word that's in front of them. This, again, is important for this reason. If you know that 80 to 90% of kids at each age level, broken down, should be there, if the child you have in front of you is not there, then you already know that they're struggling. The other thing that it does is it maps us. So if I have a child who's in grade 2, who's 6.5, and he should be here, but he's doing all the things that an early 5-year-old is doing, where should we be focusing our intervention and starting? We should be starting at where are they at, understanding this, and then pushing forward from there. So again, I want to very briefly talk about what are the most critical problems that we see in kids with reading-based difficulties. So again, if you remember the first one, it's the difficulty learning to read words accurately and fluently. And we're going to skip those 2 for a minute. And basically what we know is that when you look at children who have reading-based difficulties, the vast majority of them, 80% of kids with reading-based difficulties, it's because they're having difficulty mastering the initial phonetics, right? That whole sound-symbol relationship world is not there for them. And we're seeing them with those difficulties being able to blend and analyze words, so that phoneme awareness. And again, they're typically that alphabetic principle, they're having a great deal of difficulty learning letter-sound correspondences. And again, we in English also like to throw some more curveballs at them. How many sounds does B have? Right? It only has 1, right? But how many sounds does C have? It has 2, right? And then some of our vowels, all of our vowels always have a long sound and a short sound, right? So again, this mapping is difficult for some of them because, you know what, there are certain letters, but not all of the consonants have 2 sounds, but all of our vowels do have 2 sounds, right? So again, they're having difficulty with mapping those on top of each other. The other thing that impacts, if you can't decode words, you can't read words, and you're reading very slowly, then you're typically also not developing sight vocabulary. So sight vocabulary means if you're taking so long to decode every word, you have a very limited exposure to text because you're slower, you're not reading all those words. And again, typically because they don't have those strategies to identify those words in text, it's very hard to identify a word in text if you can't read most of the words that go around it. If you can read most of the words that go around it, most of us can fill in what the word should be. If you can't read hardly any of the words, you cannot get a context to know what that word is. So when we look at the nature of underlying difficulty for most children who have reading difficulties or very specific reading difficulties, we see that weakness in phonological area of language ability, and we say that it could be inherent, it could be intrinsic, or it can be a disability. So inherent means that there are some children who will walk into your school who have not had any exposure to sounds, to books. Automatically, they have an inherent deficit in this area because they haven't had the exposure. To a certain degree, a child who with ESL or ELL is walking in and they don't have that exposure to English, so they are inherently already behind, okay? For some kids it is intrinsic, they don't have the motivation, right? There is no motivation. And there are some kids where it is a disability. So we know somewhere between 5 to 7% of kids, maybe as high as 10 based on the research, will have a reading-based learning disability. Okay? It is a little bit lower than the number that Paul suggested to you this morning. It's probably somewhere between 5 to 7, 10 at the max. Okay? And again, all of those are expressed primarily in the development or the delays in the development of those phonemic awareness and phonetic skills. And again, reading is difficult because every phony is made up of a very unique articulatory gesture. It each has its own sound. They differ in place and manner of articulation and in voicing, right? And again, things that make reading, again, so we kind of think about that. For what makes it difficult for some students is if you take the words fat and friend. Again, fat, that f is really strong. In the friend, the F is harder to hear, right? Because now we're blending those two together. That's kind of that co-articulation. And I did not look at the center table. Thank you very much. Okay, so again, beat and ball is another example of that. Again, and that co-articulation is really important because, again, a lot of our pronunciation overlaps, so you're not hearing the single sound. You're hearing more of a seamless beat of sound. So that really, again, for that kid who's struggling with alphabetic principle and some of those phonemic awareness skills, that's really throwing them for a loop. So again, this is kind of the more theoretical reason why that's happening. All of the phonemes are abstracted from the speech stream, so we're getting them by hearing them. And again, because phonemes have many different alphonic variations on how we hear them or how they're said, we sometimes have a lot of difficulty pulling out the single sound for a letter, okay? So that's why we have some of those difficulties. The other thing that you need to know about reading is that what we know is that when we look at the phonological language domain, it's pretty much like every other talent that's distributed in the population, it's normally distributed. Right? So what does that mean if our phonologic talent is under that normal curve? What it means is, and that's a beautiful normal curve you're all familiar with, it means that there are going to be some children who are going to walk into school and they are just really strong and have a lot of talent in phonemic awareness. Okay? So my daughter would be one who walked into school with a lot of phonemic awareness skills. It took us like an hour to pick this picture because she felt it was good enough. But it also means that some kids are going to be weak. So some children are going to be a little bit moderately weak. So remember when I had that one slide, why do we teach every child, or why is it important to teach every child phonetic skills? There it is, because you're going to have a bunch of children who are going to walk in who are automatically just weak at the skill because it's a talent and they have less of the talent than other people. And then we're going to have some that have some very serious difficulty because they're at the very lowest point, about 2% of the population. The other thing that we have to think about in terms of phonological language development is this. It's only what we found is it's very weakly correlated with intelligence. So your level of intelligence does not predict your level of phonological skill development. So if you were to take a child who has high verbal intelligence but has low phonological ability, we often will say that that child has dyslexia or a reading disability. If you take a child who has low verbal ability and has low phonological ability, they are the exact same thing. They are dyslexic. So intelligence does not predict your phonetic skills very well. Right? So just because you have, if this child here, let's say this child here has an IQ of 130 and has deficits in their phonological skills, they're going to have a learning disability. If this child's IQ is 84 and has those low phonetic skills, they're going to have the exact same reading disability that the gifted student has. Right? Because phonological skills are not highly coordinated or correlated. The other thing is fluency. Fluency is that ability to read text quickly, accurately, and with proper expression. We know it's the bridge. Fluency is the bridge between reading words and comprehension. We also know that if you are a fluent reader, you can concentrate less on the words and you can concentrate on decoding, or not decoding, but you can concentrate on the understanding. So it's really key, and it becomes even more key because when we look at the challenges of growth in reading fluency, So by the time a child is in grade 4, 5, or 6, they're going to encounter about 10,000 words they've never seen before in print during a year's worth of reading. So that means they have to decode or find a way to basically understand all of those words. Each of those new words only occur about 10 times in a year's worth of reading. If you don't have good fluent decoding and skills, you're not going to be able to read those words quickly and put them in context. And again, it's very difficult to correctly guess the identity of these new words just from the context of the passage, many times. So really, we call it the simple reading hypothesis. The quicker that you can read and the more fluency you have in your reading, the better you're able to comprehend, because you're not using your resources on the reading of the words, you're using your resources on the comprehension of what you're reading, right? Here's the hard part though. What is the best intervention for reading fluency? The best reading fluency intervention is through reading and reading and reading, okay? The second thing that we know is a roadblock to becoming a good reader is insufficient vocabulary, general knowledge, and reasoning skills to comprehend or support the comprehension of written language. It's really what Shelley talked about. And what we know is, this is just a graph, very good longitudinal research done by Reed Lyon, who's a psychologist, the National Institute of Children's Mental Health, and Joseph Torgerson. And basically what they found is that if you look at children with low oral language and reading growth, or low oral language skills, what you typically find is that there's a little gap when they begin to read, but by the time you get about age 12, the gap has significantly increased because they don't have those oral language skills, right? That's how significantly oral language plays into that area. There is two speech and language pathologists a number of years ago. Their name is Hart and Risley. You may have heard of them before. They wrote a book. What they basically found is if you look at children, and they did extensive research, longitudinal research, if you have children coming in at kindergarten, JK, age 4, age 5, a child in a low SES setting typically has heard somewhere between 2 to 3 million less words than a child who comes in from a middle or upper class SES position. So the fact or the amount of oral language that they've just been exposed to is so far behind that, again, they're going to lack a lot of those oral language skills. The last issue that we have is that motivation issue. And what we know is that if you are a struggling learner in terms of your reading, and you're struggling, you're behind where you should be in grade 1, and then you're behind in grade 2, and then you're behind in grade 3, and for many of those kids, the gap's not staying the same, it's getting a little bit bigger, then a lot of those kids know that they're poor readers, okay? Again, think about it. If you really think about it, most kids, if you had to pin them down and say, what is the most important thing you're supposed to learn in grade 1? What would probably be the answer 90% of the time? By the end of grade 1, I need to be a reader, and I need to be a good reader, okay? So again, my son was like that. He was at Christmas time. He was so upset. He wasn't reading. He didn't think he was reading at the level that he should be, because he should now. He's already 3.5 months in. He should be a great reader, right? He wasn't yet. And I would say, your dad knows a little bit about this, right? Your dad does know that probably about January or February, you're going to have this reading explosion. Oh, no, I'm not. I'm not going to have no reading explosion. In January, February, he had the reading explosion. A lot of things came online, right? But again, grade 1 is very much about becoming a reader. If you're not becoming a reader, then you tend to get frustrated and you tend to get anxious, right? So school is not a good place. And Paul Barber talked about that today. And as that frustration and anxiety increases, then what typically happens is they're not motivated to read, and they lack the self-confidence in their ability to read. How many of you do things that you don't have confidence in? When you're in school, there's not a solution, right? Because you're going to school every day, and those are the things you have to keep working on. When a bunch of my friends that I went to university with decided in university that skiing was the thing that we should do, and I wasn't very good at skiing, I could at least do the one run down the hill and disappear to the bar, right? I was okay there because I didn't have to keep working on my weakness of skiing. And I could do that every single time we went to Pine Knob or wherever we went skiing, right? I could do that every single time. The anxiety and the lack of self-confidence grows because they're being asked to do something they can't do every single day, or they know that they're struggling with. So what we know is that in research is that those struggling readers will then say, okay, I need to find something to blame this on, right? I'm blaming it on the fact that I'm not reading the way I should because the teacher's giving me stuff that's too difficult. There's too much interference, there's too much noise in this classroom. I think I might have vision problems, I think I may need glasses. That's like a lot of struggling readers who do have glasses. Where are their glasses usually? Not at school, so they can say, you know what, I don't have my glasses. And they'll even often blame teachers, right? Again, what we know is they're typically doing that to basically save their own, don't put it on their own intelligence, don't put it on their own self-esteem and their own self-worth, okay? Again, we all do it, we do it all the time. Think about your last 3 breakups in a relationship. Every single time, whose fault was it? Not yours, it was theirs, right? We're always protecting our own self-esteem that way, okay? The thing that we have to watch as teachers is that sometimes those kids do become very reluctant to participate. They tend to avoid it. They tend to do everything that they can to avoid it, and sometimes they will become more defiant, and that lack of motivation becomes even clearer. And as they get older, they often will either go to the hideout rule, like blend into the wall so I don't have to read, or they will often sometimes become a little bit more confrontive, class clown, act out a little bit more. Again, they're doing that so they can avoid reading in front of their peers. This is a website that I often go back to. I know that sometimes, basically what it does is it gives you every sound, and it kind of reminds you what each sound in the alphabetic principle should sound like. I know that sometimes when I walk out of some classrooms, I'm not sure what sound the S makes anymore because I've now heard 37 variants of it. Right? I remember when I was a young psychologist and I would go into some of our SLD rooms, and back then when I started we had GLD rooms, and they were doing like mad math minutes. I heard so many things of what 7 times 7 was, I no longer knew what 7 times 7 was, so I would typically have to go check it. So this is, again, it's a quick tool. It'll allow you to kind of hear those sounds. They do it for consonant and for vowels. Sometimes I like to review it once a year just to kind of put my head around to make sure I'm hearing those right.